So this research was on negotiating and mediating moral concern through intergroup encounters. And so the main question here was, when and why does one have moral reactions to suffering outgroups, and what factors influence this? And so really they just kind of did an analysis and breakdown of a lot of existing research and information that kind of relates to this, and intergroup interactions, intergroup conflict, and looking at studies and the information we have about when moral concern is elicited or not. And then of specific note, they kind of focused on two main areas, which is how people react to sharing narratives of people suffering. So whether that's a personal story or an interview, as well as media exposure. So if you see a picture of a disaster or something like that. So what they looked at were kind of the larger implications of this, where there's limitations, and where there's contradictions. So that was a main focus, actually, was looking at, there's a lot of research that might say that these are really good outlets, but there's also a lot of limitations that exist, and contradictions where it has the exact opposite effect. So if, and actually there was one part that I wanted to read on this, which was from the article, like they noted, polling data shows an inverse association between perceiving one's own group as compassionate and feeling empathy toward the outgroup in conflict. So I found that really interesting. Another piece they touch on is also about, slacktivism and compassion fatigue. So where media exposure and things actually get us to the point where we think we care, but we're not really caring. We're not really taking any steps forward from there. So no, we can go to the next slide now. So the overall results for this study show that there is truth between, existing research that does show a link between exposure to an outgroup suffering and eliciting moral concern, but it's just not that simple. So the main takeaway that the authors found after evaluating everything is that it's very contextual. So there is basically a place and a time where these will elicit the right response that one is looking for. And there's times where it will either elicit other emotions or other reactions, sometimes of which are very negative. So we also know that, in any conflict, moving someone to moral concern or compassion can be really critical. It can be a really big component of that, and having people see outside of their own perspective, whether that's somebody that's actually involved in that conflict directly, or whether it's trying to get people from the outside to take part in resolving that and enacting peace building. So I think for the contextual details, the authors offer some suggestions in their conclusion about what that may look like. But really, I think it's, for anyone who's actively involved, either as a mediator or an expert in that field, I think just to really take full evaluation of what the situation is like, and all the details, and, the groups that are involved. And, I think also evaluating what really matters to those groups who are seeing these kinds of things to make sure you're going to get the right response.
Did they offer any suggestions as to like what were the contexts or conditions under which people seem to feel more compassion during as a result of suffering?
So it's interesting because they do offer some, like, in general, some ideas, and they reference some studies where things looked like it was working versus when it wasn't, for instance. But there's not a lot that's super direct, I guess, because I think it really depends on the groups and kind of what you're dealing with. But they mentioned like an Israeli-Palestinian study, where they said, kind of having that intergroup interaction and hearing different narratives was actually detrimental. It caused kind of like a defensive, hostile reaction. Yeah. Opposed to what they hoped would have been an understanding or compassion. But then they note similar other studies that were done in Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, where they get groups together and they, are able to share their perspectives, and there is compassion built. And so I guess that's where it's not as cut and dry, and even what they're suggesting, because they're showing even in the same conflict with the same groups and similar situations, you had different reactions that happened. So
I would imagine it's a complex, you know, sort of contextual issue where it's like, who exactly is involved? When are they involved? What is the space in which this is being conducted? You know, I would imagine that all that kind of plays an effect, because we certainly see it, right? Like if we do peace building in an organization, it's like, whose office are we in? Are we in someone's office? Are we in an offsite location? Are we in a conference room? That can all have some contextual, and it holds power dynamics and that sort of thing. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think that was a lot of the focus of this too. And especially one of the things that they touched on most in this, you know, really big focus, as mentioned, was kind of on like the media aspect. You know, they looked at like communication research and how this has been played out. And that especially, you know, is and that was, you know, kind of the other piece of that, where they're like, sometimes it does elicit like a reaction, but it's not necessarily the reaction you're looking for. And it doesn't even mean that it's negative, but, you know, they said what you could have hoped was like a compassionate response, or a response that would move you to help people, might actually come off as like anger, like you're angry at the situation, or you want to like punish the party that you feel is behaving incorrectly, opposed to actually just helping the people. So I think, you know, I think all of that definitely takes, and it's hard. Yeah, it's a very complex issue. I think it's difficult to say what exactly is the right or wrong way to do it, or where.
Yeah, I feel like this just highlights the importance of the individual and how unique everyone responds to conflict, and especially like compassion and things. And what's arising for me is this notion that peace starts from within, right? So depending on that person in different contexts, Natalie, you mentioned like could be the exact same person in the exact same situation, or not the exact same person, two different people in the exact same situation being exposed to, you know, trying to kind of being exposed to the other side, and still interpreting it differently, and responding to it differently. It reminds me of a lot of like trauma-informed work that I've done, right? And how two individuals can experience, kind of have the same upbringing, experience the same traumatic situation, but then they respond to it differently. And for some, it lingers longer, because it has to do with that internal part as well as the external part. I mean, compassion especially is something that I feel like absolutely, that's like that piece starting from within, like learning to respond with compassion. It's something that you work at continuously as an individual. So to generalize it, I feel like it's very difficult, which the study shows, right? That being able to generalize, oh, this works when you do this, or this doesn't work when you do that. It's very hard to do that.
yeah,
right?
well, and I think it also individuals' preferences change based on context. So if you take the same individual in different settings, their reaction could change. And you put that same individual in the same setting, but all of a sudden at a group, and then that person's in a group setting, that can also change things. So it's so context specific. There's so many different components, I think.
Absolutely. And Sarah, what you're mentioning too about like working on compassion reminds me of doing like compassion trainings. You know, I wonder how tying that into like these kinds of conversations also impacts things.
So it made me think of two things. One is, you know, the commercials that we often see about the dogs, and I'm using like that because it elicits such a heart response. But the abused animals from, you know, mass breeding and that kind of thing. And so they keep showing those commercials. And at first you're like, oh my goodness, this is so horrible. I'm going to make a contribution or whatever. But then you keep seeing it And then it gets to the point where it begins to make me feel bad. So I avoid them. When they come on, I turn the channel because I don't want to feel the way it makes me feel anymore. And it's the same thing with the commercials that they used to have. I don't remember the organization, but it was about, feeding children in impoverished areas around the world. I mean, the first child you see, with the tears, so you feel horrible. And either you do something or you don't. But the more you see it, it makes you feel bad. And so then I avoid seeing that because I don't like how it makes me feel. Whether I've done something or not, it still highlights that maybe I haven't done enough. And so, yeah, I would avoid that. And I can see that might be, something that other people might experience as well. And then the other thing it made me think about is particularly in conflicts between two people. And when I'm working with them, I can't rush to the part where I'm asking one side or the other to feel empathy for the other. I have to let them go through the process. And usually that involves them getting to share, them getting to tell me their side and how they feel. They're generally not interested in how the other people feel until they've gotten to express their experience and their feelings from it. And once I've allowed them to exhaust that and I've asked the questions and kind of given them a chance to purge, then, and it's not all the time, but then it's at that point where I can kind of gauge whether, okay, so maybe now they're ready to hear things from the other person's perspective. But it's almost never early on in the process.
Yeah, they've gotta know that they're being cared for and they have a voice too. That might be an interesting piece to this, is part of the context is being not just sort of reading about someone else's issues or but actually being able to express yourself first before reading about the others, reading about the conflict or the issue. And that could be helpful. I had something on the first. What was the first point you said, Tony? Oh, so I was thinking inoculation, because people, like, after a while, I think, there's a good piece of that where it's like you see something over and over and then it starts making you feel bad, you want to avoid it. And there's another piece of that is like inoculation of just like you become desensitized to it,
Mm-hmm. Yep, I agree.